God sort of withdraws from an area so that there is a non-God zone into which can be filled creation. Creation can only happen if there is a fragmentation, a breakage, and the world is therefore fundamentally flawed. In fact, God personally, in the divine self, is understood as broken by the process of creation.
Hi, my name is Raj Pandya. I'm the director of the John R. Kirk Planetarium, where we are right now, and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at SUNY New Paltz. So I present shows, I promote shows, I guide students, and I'm also involved with the observatory that we have on campus as well, where people can go and actually look at the stars and planets and galaxies. So I really love astronomy. That's my favorite subject, of course, and that's kind of why I got into this. I think it's cool, like what we can know about the universe by observation and using the scientific method and testing our ideas and seeing, where that leads us. And it's also really fun to know what we don't know, because many times when we learn more about the universe, we run into more questions. And I don't think we're ever going to know everything. I don't think it's possible to know everything about the universe. People say, we are star stuff or we're made of star dust. That's a really interesting topic, and I do get into that in my class. And the science behind it is, look at our bodies. We know what atoms we're mostly made of. And if you look at life in general on this planet, the key element seems to be carbon. Carbon can be bonded to many other elements and make long chains. And a question we might ask is, where did that carbon come from? Where did the elements come from? If we go even further back, we just say, where did the Earth itself come from? It's made of heavy elements. They didn't just show up one day. Where were they made? And so something we talk about a lot in astronomy is what we call nucleosynthesis, where stars are able to fuse small elements to make bigger ones. And stars have been doing this for billions of years through the history of the universe and have built up heavy elements. Now, some stars are very massive stars. At the end of their lives, they'll actually explode in what's called a supernova. When they explode, they can make even heavier elements, and they spread those elements through interstellar space. That's stardust. That dust coming from the death of a massive star, which could then go into a nebula, another cloud of gas and dust. And if that nebula is under the right conditions, it can form a new star. Then that star can live its life, and through nuclear fusion, make new elements, and then spread those elements out when it dies. And so this can happen for generations, and it must have happened for generations, because it built up the heavy elements in the universe. So only after a long period of time of doing this could you have something like the Earth being made, which is made of very heavy elements like iron, nickel, metals and rocks, things like that. And so when we say we're stardust, we're the result of stellar evolution. That's where those elements first came from. A really interesting thing I tell my students is, any element past iron on the periodic table of elements. So iron is number 26. Anything past that must have been made in a very intense explosion, which is a supernova. Any elements past iron. And so these are elements we use in everyday life. You can think of like gold, silver, iodine. And that some of those, like iodine, those atoms are in our body, and they are there and they help us live. And so those elements were first made in supernova explosions, and now we're made of that. So that's the sense that people often say we're made of stardust, and scientifically, it all leads back to stars and nuclear fusion.
So when we're talking about stardust and what we're made of, during the planetarium show I can show people like where it would be, and then we fly right in and then it shows up right there. So this is an example of where new elements are made. So this is the stardust that we're talking about. So this is the remnants of a massive star that exploded, and it spit its guts out basically into space with heavy elements in there. And previous generations of stars like this must have also lived and died and made the heavy elements.
Now it's interesting, but you can relate the whole Kabbalah of the sparks to modern scientific understanding of how all of the different elements that make up the world got here. Because once upon a time, all of the universe consisted pretty much of just hydrogen and helium, and that was it. And the oldest generation of stars were mostly hydrogen being fused into helium. But as the fusion process ages and the star begins to collapse of its own gravity, it explodes out, and in this explosion stews up all of the different heavier elements. Every other element that's heavier than helium, which basically is everything. And so everything that we know as world, everything that's a mineral or a vegetable or an animal, is only possible because of all of these atoms that were cooked in stars. And so in a very, very realistic way, everything in our world is made up of exactly the same thing, stardust. And so that is a kind of a scientific parallel to the understanding that everything in the world is imbued with the sparks. And it really ends up amounting to the same thing. We can feel kinship with not only everyone else, but everything else, knowing that in the end we're all made up of the same materials that got here in the same way, as well as understanding that we are spiritually imbued with this divine light energy, which is what makes everything in existence do what it does. Kabbalah teaches that when God created the world, and there are different stories for that. There's the holy light poured into the vessels. There's the Tzimtzum story, where God sort of withdraws from an area so that there is a non-God zone into which can be filled creation. But no matter what story is used, the result is that creation can only happen if there is a fragmentation, a breakage. And the world is therefore fundamentally flawed. In fact, God personally, in the divine self, is understood as broken. But every time you see a tree with all those branches going up into the sky, there is another tree under the ground which branches are going deeper and deeper. So that every tree is really two different fractals, although one is open and one is hidden. And there are many, many, many fractal images in the world. We're reminded that every time we take a breath, the air is passing down the trunk of a system that branches and branches and branches, and you have an entire tree in your lungs. And your blood is circulating through trees of capillaries, and your nerves branch out from your brain in a kind of a fractal pattern. And your lymphatic system, we're just fractals upon fractals. Everywhere you look, there are these fractal patterns. Every fern growing, every seashell spiraling. And it seems to me that a fractal is the boundary that exists between order and chaos. And that however God created this world, built into that creation is this idea that things can happen the way they happen. There is a kind of a guidance or parameters of the growth, but within those parameters there can be any kind of chaotic exuberance. So a tree doesn't fractal to all infinity, it fractals to the point of the leaves, and then it stops. And then the nervous system fractals to the point where it needs to be, and then it stops. So there is this fascinating boundary between order and chaos. And to me, when I look at the creation story in Genesis, I see exactly this. I see God ordaining a system in which chaos is allowed a certain amount of latitude, but order also prevails. And the two have to dance this tight choreography for all time. I have experience of God. And so for me, God becomes virtually an assumption. And then, when contemplating existence, I can see God's role. It's like the story in Torah where Moses says to God, "Let me see you in your fullness." And God says to him a line that is usually translated, "No man can see me and live. No man can see my face and live." Although I think it's better translated, "No one can see my face who is alive." And then the story continues. God says, "I will walk by you, and you cannot see my face, but you can see my back." And we have this image of this anthropomorphized giant God walking by, And if you saw God's face, you would be burned to a cinder. And it sounds like it's a Greek legend and not a piece of the Bible. But this is poorly translated. First of all, the word for face in Hebrew is also the word for before. And God doesn't say you can see my back, which in Hebrew is gav. God says you can see my acharai, which means my after. You cannot see what's before me, but you can see my after. Before God would mean we understand why God created the world. We understand what God is in the absolute transcendent sense. This is ridiculous. This is not possible. We are creatures of existence in the world. We can only see what is in the world with us. We can sometimes see the world more or less as a whole, but we're still seeing the world. So we can see the aftermath of God, but we cannot see before. So whenever I talk about creation, I'm talking basically about the wake of God, the aftermath of God, who I simply assume. The before, I can't know anything about. There are a lot of people who have a great deal of trouble with the word God and thinking if is there any way they could possibly bring such a thing into their life, and they just don't seem to be able to do it. And they bring up issues of people suffering, and they bring up all sorts of evils, the existence of evil. Most people can't bring God into their lives because they assume that that term comes with an enormous amount of baggage. All the inherited garbage that's been accreted over millennia. That doesn't have to be the way you hear the word God. You have the right and the power to re-explore the idea of God and strip it of all that baggage and bring it into your life in the way that it works for you.
What is it? Co-emergent quest, magnetic joining of spirit and matter. What is it? All of it. The whole messy, elegant armload of form evolving, mutating, arranging itself from void into multitudes. The hands holding this paper. Is it a moment? A choreographed phrase of Shiva's dance? Are we dancing? Being danced? Both? What would Descartes say to the blissfully merged yogi? You think, therefore you are. The yogi retorts, I am that I am. Will this quest cease? Would breaking some code satisfy this hunger? 4 words keep me seeking in this wild sea of wonder. I just don't know.